Hello and welcome to the final episode of Season 1 of IFPRI's new show, Inside Track, where we bring to you stories of IFPRI researchers, how they got started, their current work, and how they hope to contribute to a sustainable future. My name is Smita Aggarwal, and joining me today is my colleague, Sylvan Herskowitz, an Associate Research Fellow in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division here at IFPRI. Before we dig into more questions and knowing more about Sylvan, let me remind our online audiences, you can join this conversation too. Drop your questions in the comment section below, and we'll try to take them up at the end of the session. So, Sylvan started his career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger, where he worked on issues related to education and gender, a stint which greatly shaped his interest and future career in international development. So let's hear from Sylvan. Welcome to the show, Sylvan.
Thanks.
So let's dive right into it. Tell us a little bit about your professional background.
Sure. I think coming out of undergrad, I was really interested in issues of global poverty and basically started working at a nonprofit in New York, which was fun and interesting for a little while, and then I wanted to get some more experience kind of on the ground and seeing what things actually looked like in different parts of the world. So as you mentioned, I had 2 years abroad with the Peace Corps in Niger, and that was even more formative, especially getting kind of sensitized and interested in issues around kind of gender and education in developing countries. And from there, I came back. I actually was down the street at SAIS, where I did a master's at Johns Hopkins International Affairs, and continued to study development. And then that was kind of what whet my appetite for studying economics. And from there, I decided, all right, I'm going to go abroad again. And for a year, I worked as a consultant for the World Bank on 2 impact evaluations. And at that point, I'd kind of resolved that I wanted to double down a bit further on economics and take it to another level. So I applied to PhD programs from when I was living in Malawi, and ultimately ended up at Berkeley in their agricultural and resource economics program.
Interesting. So how did you first hear about IFPRI, and were you familiar with their work?
So that was really, I think I first caught wind of IFPRI when I was living in Malawi. And as I said, that was sort of as I was getting more interested in economics as kind of a discipline, and was very interested in development. And I knew of some of the IFPRI researchers who were actually embedded, or I think at that point they were actually had their desks in the Ministry of Agriculture in Malawi. And I thought that was really interesting to see this organization that was both taking research really seriously, but also really working closely with foreign governments and assessing the questions that really needed to be answered in those settings. So I'd kind of first heard of IFPRI in that setting. Now I didn't have any idea at that point that I would end up coming back to work at IFPRI, but that was where it kind of first put IFPRI on the map for me, was when I was living abroad.
Interesting. So was international development your first choice, or rural and agricultural international development?
Yeah, I think I came around, I was definitely just interested in kind of global poverty and international development. And I think certainly there's a lot of overlaps with rural issues, and that's because that's where a lot of poor people in the developing world live. And so there's a natural sort of intersection of those types of issues. And I think generally my research topics haven't necessarily been on agriculture or even rural necessarily. They've been more about household decision making and maybe behavioral biases and how households manage their finances. But there's lots of overlap with those issues, and maybe how a farmer manages their farm, or how families make decisions about sending their kids to school or whatever else. So I think I've drifted in this direction, and it is one of perhaps many interests that I have as kind of a researcher.
So it seems like there's a broad canvas you work on within this field. So
Definitely.
Could you walk us through what does your typical day look like here at IFPRI?
Sure. I'm working on right now about 8 different projects, and I'd say that any given project, they have very different phases of kind of work. And to kind of characterize what a given project might look like, you have on some level sort of like the kind of academic sitting back and thinking about a topic or an issue, whether it's, girls' education or farmers improving their yields or whatever else. And you think about what else does the literature say about this? What are the big questions? And then there's the second part, which is much more concrete. And you're thinking much more about what's going on the ground. Is there a policy that we want to assess? Is there an intervention that we're trying to measure its impact? And that's much more concrete, getting a sense of some of the data that exists. What do things really look like? And kind of meeting those two sides together, you're probably going to start thinking about writing grants, convincing someone that this is a topic worthy of inquiry that kind of is linking both practically what's happening, like what's the relevant question, as well as what is sort of the open kind of broader questions. And those are sort of the big picture things. Now, once that happens, if you have funding and go to your study, you then start engaging in maybe data analysis right away if there's existing data, or if not, you're designing your own surveys. You're maybe going out to the field and actually meeting with people who you expect are affected by this policy, this intervention. You're meeting with stakeholders. You are then hopefully coming back and doing your data analysis, writing your papers up, trying to figure out how best to communicate your results, presenting it, refining it, and hopefully ultimately publishing it and getting it out a bit more, disseminating your work. So sorry, all to say to loop back, given the diversity of activities that are in any given project, what I'm doing on a given day kind of depends on which fire I'm putting out on that given day, which project is kind of most in need of attention, and putting my attention on that portion of that work. But it could be calls, it could be data work sitting at my computer, it could be a trip to the field, it could be any of a wide range of things.
So no 2 days look similar, would you say?
I think that's fair. Yeah,
okay.
That's fair to say.
So we'll talk more about you putting out fires later in the chat.
Sure.
But, and you've given us a bit of an idea of the kind of work you do, but could you elaborate more on what is your current focus of
like what is my research right now? Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think I have something like 8 projects going on right now. And right now, as someone who's joined IFPRI relatively recently and who's in kind of the research fellow track, I've carried in with me a number of projects that I was doing during my PhD while I was at Berkeley. And so a number of those aren't necessarily classically IFPRI themes. One of my biggest projects was on sports betting in Uganda. Another project's been on firm response to violence in Afghanistan. Another on on sort of soft skills programs for youth in Liberia, and a whole range of those are kind of 3 or 4 of the main ones that I've done there. I'm still kind of working on those. Basically, the unfortunate reality is that the publication process, especially in economics, is really slow. It takes a long time, and that's hopefully to the benefit of them becoming better and better projects. But IFPRI fortunately gives us some time to continue working on those when we first join and get them published. So I'm still spending some time on those, but more and more I'm getting involved with kind of IFPRI-linked projects. One of those is looking at the effect of kind of drought and shocks on household conception choices. Another is looking really at data and trying to understand better the relationship between overall household resources and how they choose to allocate that across types of food categories. And another project we've been looking at that I've been launching more in the last few months or the last year or so is looking at the financial sector in certain countries and how the financial sector serves people in agricultural value chains. And in particular with an emphasis towards sort of marginalized populations, whether those are ethnic minorities or women, and how they are being included or excluded from financial services in these areas. The opportunities going with them.
Could you talk to us a little bit more about the financial services project? Sure. At what stage are you at? And if you're able to share a few things of how you're designing the project?
So that's a project, it's a 4-year project, and the parts that I'm involved with are the components that are in Vietnam and Indonesia. And those are kind of middle income countries right now, and they have these booming agricultural sectors, but as I was sort of alluding to, just because that sector is booming doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has equal access to these opportunities. So the first year of the program is in both of these countries, working with our research partners that are both in research institutions in those countries linked to their ministries of agriculture, taking an assessment of the state of financial services, whether it's for smallholder farmers or for kind of aggregators for people further up the agricultural value chain. So in that first year was kind of taking stock of what are the policies that are in place, what are sort of the programs or private sector actors that are in place. And then from there, we're hoping that in years kind of 2 through 4, we will have identified a suitable partner for a more kind of rigorous impact evaluation type study, where we can not just say, look, we think there are some gaps here, but we can hopefully test 1 or 2 different methods of sort of intervention and seeing if those can actually help bring more people into this kind of booming sector and be able to benefit from kind of the growth that's happening there.
Why do you think this issue is important, financial services in that region?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, I've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I think, again, it's good to see that these are growing countries overall, but just because a country is growing, I mean, I think globally this is true, we're more and more concerned about kind of the dispersion of people's wealths in different countries. And so, it's great if average incomes are rising, but we also want to make sure that people aren't being left behind and people are being included. And so this is sort of a direct effort to look at how people who have historically potentially been marginalized or maybe just haven't been able to, for whatever reason, take advantage of these opportunities to make sure that they are getting at least one path forward towards sort of greater prosperity and kind of out of poverty, hopefully.
So with different kind of research projects that you're working on, and all of them are at different stages, when it comes to a fruition, what is your hope? How will it change things on ground?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends. The different projects I think have different objectives. I think there are some projects where it's about putting a topic on the map that maybe has not gotten its due attention. And I feel like for my project on sports betting, I think part of why I'm proud of it, even though it's still hopefully getting close to finish, but not quite there, is that it's raised attention about an issue that I think people didn't necessarily take all that seriously. Where in fact gambling and sports betting in large parts of the world, including our own, has a really big impact potentially on people's lives. Now, another type of policy intervention or outcome you might want to see from a project is a direct policy prescription, to be able to say, look, this method of engagement is really effective, this one is not, and that really gives policymakers a direct line towards action, and you can hopefully assume that there's going to be some better outcomes based on your kind of research and the suggestions you make. So it's all kind of case by case. Sometimes it's about awareness raising, sometimes it's direct, this method is better than that method. And
so you would say research has different purposes, serves different purposes.
Yeah, different projects serve different purposes. I think that's a fair way of characterizing it.
Interesting. We talked about, and you touched upon it a little bit, about different stages in the research cycle, so to say. What stage excites you the most?
On any given day, any one of those stages I can truly love and find a lot of joy in. I can also say probably the reverse, that can also bring great anguish on a bad day. But the stepping back and getting to think big picture about tough questions and try and formulate ideas and hypotheses about something that's sort of unknown and is a really exciting process. That's also really fun and maybe a really nerdy way when you get your data finally comes back and you're running your first analyses and seeing whether or not what you hypothesized was true or not true or whatever else, and seeing what you can really learn that's new. And then of course it's really fun once you've spent a lot of time thinking that through, going through all your robustness checks, building up your confidence in your results, and then getting to share it with people. I mean, that's maybe the best part. Once you can kind of then communicate to new people and be like, look, here's this interesting question and we didn't have information on it, and now we've done this study, we probably invested 2 to 6 years of your life, depending on how long that project lasts, and here's what we've learned. And when you see other people getting excited about it, that's pretty exciting as well.
Interesting. That brings me to my next question, in fact. Of these stages, if you could talk to us a little bit about which was the most rewarding and which was the most challenging.
Most rewarding. I mean, I think I already sort of alluded to what I liked about the rewarding side. I think the challenging side can be, especially with impact evaluations, they can get messy and they're big and they're, you spend a lot of time with your implementing partners and they initially are really excited about your research study and you hope everyone's on board, and then realities on the ground change. Something at the national level affects the implementation of their program, or they realize they have deliverables and they're behind getting them done, and there becomes a tension between sort of this nice, neat implementation plan you might have for a research project and sort of the realities of what else is going on the ground. And that can certainly be frustrating when you might have to tear up some of your hard, spent planning or whatever else, and try and see what can be recouped and what can be adjusted and what can be not. But it's just sort of the reality also of working in these contexts and in these types of settings. I mean, there's other times where maybe you had a really well-founded hypothesis, you designed a really nice study, and then you look at your estimates and your results, and it turns out your hypothesis was wrong. And maybe you can still learn something from that, or maybe just the data is really noisy and you can't learn as much as you'd want from it. So, that you have to kind of take the wins along with the losses and be excited when the good things happen and not get too deep down in the darkness when things go badly.
So actually that brings us to our next question. So how do you keep yourself motivated during this long drawn process? You mentioned that research sometimes takes 2 to 4 years or maybe longer. So what keeps you going?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really truly do enjoy all steps of that process, just sort of innately. Like, I like the process, so I think that helps. I think one thing I've learned, especially over time, is that being in the trenches with people together certainly helps you have a little more resilience when things go wrong. I think if you're on a project by yourself, then sort of you're in a world of your own pain potentially, and it helps to have, you know, a friend or a colleague there with you, and you can kind of pull each other through. But, you know, I think broadly it's just that I do enjoy those different steps, that they, you know, and because I'm kind of schizophrenically working on 8 different projects, you know, if one is just sort of in a bad place, you can always kind of like set it aside for a little while, come back to it when you've had a chance to let your blood pressure decrease a little bit, and spend some time on the ones that are a little more rewarding until you kind of have to turn back.
Oh, that's interesting. So, you know, I know a lot of our online audiences may be interested in this and may be interested in joining IFPRI at some stage.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us a little bit more about what does the research track at IFPRI looks like? I know that in-house
Sure.
Associate Research Fellow, which I learned just yesterday, is called an ARF.
Sure.
So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit more. It's not necessarily uniform for all divisions, but my process that I went through, at least coming in out of basically an economics degree, they put out a job posting at the there's sort of a Central American Economics Association, and each year they put out a listing of the main jobs in kind of like economic research that are being listed that year. And so, you know, I applied to that job, but IFPRI only had one position that year. So you kind of, by necessity, are applying to a very wide range of jobs. And, you know, if you are hoping around, you know, Thanksgiving time that they're telling you that they want to interview you at the economics conference that's in January. In January, you have kind of a speed dating blitz through whoever wanted to interview you, and then you wait nervously by your phone, hoping that some of them will invite you to their campuses if it's a university, or to, you know, their headquarters if it's a research organization, and come present your work. And so I came to IFPRI and I, you know, gave a seminar here. You know, I got grilled with a bunch of questions. I met with a whole bunch of people in the division. And then you wait again nervously by your phone, hoping that somebody that you met with will make you an offer. And so fortunately for me, that is what ended up happening. I ended up getting the offer from IFPRI, and I was thrilled. And so, as I'd mentioned, I'd already had in my head some familiarity with IFPRI and the type of work they do, and so I was pretty excited when that came together.
Interesting. So in this role, what would you say are some of the most valuable skills? We do have a lot of our online audiences who are joining us from different universities, schools, ag schools. So if you could share with us a few of those skills.
Yeah, and as I kind of sketched out earlier, different parts of any given research project really demand very different skills. So it's hard to pinpoint and say like, oh, this is the thing or this is the thing. I think they all are kind of the thing at different points in time. Some of them are really soft skills. They're about like, are you able to communicate well with people from different cultures? Are you able to work well with, you know, people who are in high positions of power? Are you able to communicate well with people who are farmers from rural areas, and, you know, maybe the education their education level is lower, or maybe just your ability to communicate is much lower. Those are really valuable at certain times and really important. At other phases, you know, it's about attention to detail and being really meticulous and making sure the logistics of a research implementation project are happening according to plan. It could be analytical thinking and being precise in your hypotheses and what you want to test, or it could just be straight up coding, and, you know, are you good at using your statistical software and making sure that, you know, you're doing things carefully and clearly and that your results come through. Or it's kind of communicating and disseminating information, and that's a different type of communication than with your partner or with, you know, farmers or rural populations. It's about, you know, communicating to other academics or other policymakers, and those are all, you know, very different skills, but I feel like at different points in time they really have a critical impact on sort of the overall success of a given project.
You know, there are a lot of students who are probably in their master's program and are considering probably going for a doctoral degree, an advanced degree, but maybe skeptical. What would you say, what would be your advice to them? What kind of homework they should do before they make the plunge?
So skepticism is very healthy, and I would encourage you to be skeptical. Now I'll say, I feel very strongly that I'm thrilled with like the kind of career that I have, and as I've mentioned, I really love each of those phases of a portfolio of my work as a researcher. But I think it's worth, if you're thinking about making that really big investment of going into a PhD program, and I'm hoping I'm not the first person who's going to say this, but they are not always fun and enjoyable. You should really be confident that it's going to put you in a place that you're excited about. And I just say that for yourself, you know, you might love to travel, but that doesn't mean that this job is right for you. You might love nerdy data work, but that doesn't mean that this job is necessarily right for you. You might love both of those things, but this job might not be right for you. You really kind of want to think through each of those phases. Like, well, will I enjoy the writing up of results? Because you're going to be forced to do all of those things a lot. And so just to kind of think it through, try it on and make sure that you really have a lot of conviction in where it will land you before you start, because it will save you a whole lot of kind of existential anxiety during those early coursework years that can be challenging no matter how wonderful of an institution you might have had the opportunity to go to.
Right. So you would say the think and then think some more.
I'd say that. I'd say, you know, giving yourself a gut check is really important. You don't want to just go in blind because you think it's like an obvious or cool or fun thing to do. I think, unfortunately, I didn't heed my own advice, and that was why I had a lot of sort of doubt in my early years of my PhD. And turns out everything broke in a nice direction. I actually do love all of those phases, but I could have and should have done more to really suss out that each of those things were something that really appealed to me.
Interesting. Well, before I dive into the last question for our session, I would like to invite and remind our online audiences they can ask Sylvan questions too. Just drop your question in the comment box below and we'll try to accommodate it at the end of the session. So Sylvan, this is our last question, hopefully. For our online audiences or those waiting in the wings, do you have any final piece of advice?
Advice? You mean for people who are thinking about this as a career? I mean, I think that's the big one, to really sort of make sure you're doing everything you can to give yourself that stress test. And I think just to talk to a lot of people also, like, this is my opinion, but lots of people have different takes on this. Some people think, you know, it's important if you're going to do a career in economics to kind of plow through really quickly and do all your math degrees and supporting coursework and then just blaze through, don't waste time. For me, especially working in development, it was really important to spend a lot of time living abroad. And I think that's actually, although my route through an economics PhD, I think has been slower than other people because I spent more time doing other stuff before I started, I think it's actually served me well. I think my experiences, you know, in Peace Corps in Niger and my time in Malawi, other stretches abroad have really been kind of foundational for me as a researcher working in development and economics to sort of generate ideas and develop my own intuition of what's going on in different places.
That's interesting. And I can see we do have a question online. We have a question from Melissa from Washington, D.C., who wants to know, quantitative research can be a bit intimidating. How can one improve their quantitative research skills?
Sure. I mean, I think it kind of depends on what your starting point is and what exactly, I guess, you mean by quantitative skills. I think quantitative skills could be straight up coding, and you know, I think there's lots of like available resources online, and I think the best thing for that is just to dive in, just start playing with data, generate some summary statistics, make some tables. There's just no replacement for just diving into it. I think other quantitative skills are sort of like understanding research design and structure. And, you know, there's a decent number of resources about that as well. There's sort of like a great handbook by Rachel Glenister on like how to design RCTs, and that's kind of maybe I mean, it's pretty technical, but I think it's also fairly accessible as well. Or, you know, just getting familiar with like the types of designs that are out there is another way of thinking of quantitative skills. But I mean, I think, again, it depends on kind of on what your existing level is and sort of what your objectives are and what degree of engagement you expect yourself to have going forward.
So how did you find, if I may follow up on that question, how did you sort of improve, so to say, or practice your quantitative skills? Did you seek help often, or?
Yeah, so I think I was kind of first exposed to those sides of things in my master's program. And then that year I took in between my master's and then deciding to go back and do a PhD, where I was a field coordinator for some impact evaluations out of the World Bank, gave me a chance to kind of do both. There was like a lot of like technical coding stuff, and so it helped me improve sort of my data analysis type skills. There's a lot of really practical skills I developed just in terms of designing surveys and like seeing what it looked like for field teams to be on the ground, and also helping to like, you know, we had some of these issues where we had to kind of renegotiate the design of a study and had to think about, okay, well, what happens if we have to change 3 cohorts into 2? You know, some of the kind of technical nuts and bolts of how to make a study work. So that practical experience, I think, really was beneficial for me. It helped me develop the skills. It also helped me get a glimpse of parts of that job overall and see that it appealed to me on a broader level.
So, you talked to us about a little bit before about working in various countries. You have worked extensively in Africa. Could you share with us some of the stories or one story which stood out for you while you were working in those countries, which made it seem that all this work that you are doing is worthwhile?
That's okay. Sorry, you went in a different direction than I was expecting. So, a story from one of these countries that made it seem like it was all worthwhile. So, sort of begging a question of like, what is the policy impact of these things? And I think that that's a little bit tricky to answer. I mean, I think partially because a lot of these projects, their policy impact in reality comes a bit later than once the project's been completed. And so that means that often, even if you're on the ground there during the study itself, you might not be there to see the fruits sort of your work. But I think that I think some of the work I mentioned before that on bedding, I do feel like that really did raise awareness in that country. Now, whether that directly changed any policies in Uganda related to sports betting or not is really hard for me to say. I mean, great awareness is one step perhaps towards change, but it's hard to know. I'm not sure if I fully answered that or not, but I think that that some of those, I think, impacts are kind of what happens a bit later on. And because I'm sort of an earlier career researcher, I like to think and hope that there will be more tangible, clear impacts later on. But one of the challenges is that there's not always a straight line between research advice and an immediate and clear change in a given policy.
Interesting. In fact, that links us to our next question. So our online audiences want to know that which are the research questions, or which is the research question that you are wanting to explore in future?
So the topic that I've gotten really excited about is actually something that I was working on back during my PhD and then abandoned it, and I regret having abandoned it. But things linked to marriage decisions, I think that they're really fascinating, and how families, often it is somewhat of a family choice as much as it's a choice of two individuals deciding to get married. But marriages are really important for the livelihoods of families and for the health of their children going forward, and how families make those decisions is something that really intrigues me. So I'm working on that a bit. That's kind of a early-ish stage project that I'm working on, and trying to think about how marriages and marriage migrations and the structure of marriage markets might matter, especially in responding to shocks.
Interesting. We have another question, in fact, on methodology. So Giordano from DC wants to know, what is your favorite method for randomization, minimum max, block, or mixed pairs? Did I get that right?
Giordano is going to get in trouble when I go visit him downstairs. I'm gonna take this one offline. I'll get back to you on that, Joe, later.
Okay, great. Thanks for being a sport, and thanks for taking all our questions today. And thanks to our online audiences for joining us today for the final episode of Inside Track. In case you missed our previous episodes, you can find them all on IFPRI's Facebook page. Do not forget to like and subscribe to our Facebook page. And to stay updated on all the updates, happenings, events, latest research at IFPRI, subscribe to our newsletter, IFPRI Insights. And with that, thank you so much for joining today, Sylvan. And until next time, it's a wrap from IFPRI's headquarters in Washington, DC. Thank you.